I love following the news. I watch it in the morning, I watch it at night, I follow along what's happening almost everywhere in the world as much as I can. And one of the things I've always noticed is that when the media is not lying, what they do is they change the view the public might have of an article just by leaving out certain facts or omissions that are intentional to spin it in a certain direction, basically to validate the argument. And this is one of them, okay? This is one of the biggest that's been around lately. There's a few, we're going to get into them today, just to make the point. But in the media lately, on CNN, MSNBC, other newspapers have been carrying the story that so many Americans are working more than one job just to keep a roof over their heads and food in their refrigerators, okay? And to hear them talk about it, they never cite statistics, but to hear them talk about it, you'd think that, my God, 20, 30, 40% of the population has more than one job. And the economy must be really bad. Well, first, the economy is not really bad. It's actually doing marvelously well. But the other thing is that very few people work more than one job. And when you look at this, these statistics from the last completed year, which is 2017, this is what you see. In the white community, roughly 5% of the people have more than one job. Black community, 5.3%, Asian community, 3.2%, Hispanic community, 3.4%. So in other words, roughly 1 out of every 20 to 1 out of every 25 people has more than one job. Okay, that's not a crisis, gang. Okay, that's about the same as it's always been. Lots of people had it, and what they don't take into account are the numbers of people that have one full-time job and a part-time job, which is really very often a business they're trying to start, a home business, something they're trying to do on their own in an entrepreneurial effort. All right, so that number is pretty much nonsense and rubbish, okay? The next thing that comes up a lot that you hear is how wages, this is one of the big criticisms right now going on, is that the wages are not growing and wages have not kept up with the consumer price index, okay? So I went over to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who actually calculates the CPI, and I put in the average household income in 1984. The median household income in 1984 in the United States was $22,000 a year. All right, and to have the same buying power today, to remain even, which they say we haven't done, you would have to have a median household income in America of $54,403 a year. All right, so a lot of you are saying, so what is the median household income today in America? The median household income in America today is $59,900 and change. So it's actually about 10% ahead of the consumer price index. So Americans are not only not earning less, they're actually earning more adjusted to inflation than they did back in the 80s, okay, as a median household income. All right, so you can blow that one away. The next thing I wanted to mention was this thing about the incidences of black men being shot and killed by police officers and how it's completely out of hand, okay? And before we get into this, I just want to explain that the black population in America is roughly 13.5% of the total population. The white population is 76.5%, roughly, okay? Now, we're going to hop over here. This is the site that's kept maintained by the Washington Post, hardly a conservative mill. And they have somebody there who's tracking every time a black person, white person, anybody gets shot and killed by a policeman. And so far this year, out of the entire country of 330 million people, 613 people have been shot and killed by police. That doesn't mean they were executed randomly, and most of them were involved with crime. The overwhelming majority, okay, 99%. All right, right now in the United States, as of this year, so far, 239 people have been killed by cops who are white, all right? And you say to yourself, yeah, well, how many black folks have been killed? Okay, well, you come up here and you click this little magic button, and how many is it? Oh, it's 116. It's less than half, all right? But then some people are going to argue, well, hold on a minute. The white population is 5 times bigger. Why isn't the number of white people being shot 5 times greater than the black community? And that's an interesting point, unless you go over here to the FBI uniform crime rates, okay? And this is for 2013. I couldn't find the more recent one, but they remain very constant from year to year. The number of, on the victim rate, white people murdered in the United States by white people, 2,509. And the number of Africans murdered by African Americans murdered by African Americans is 2,245. In other words, they're almost the same. They're very close. They're within 10% of each other. Now, how is it possible that a 1/5 of the population commits almost as many murders or is involved in crime as much as 76% of the population, okay? And the reason is that the black community has a massively higher crime rate. You're 5 or 6, if you're black and you live in a black community, you're well aware of it, you have a 5 or 6 times greater likelihood of being shot, involved with crime, arrested, and so forth than if you live in a white community. That's all there is to it. Those are the numbers. They've been around for years, okay? It's all very sad, okay? So those are the numbers, and so the next time people say, oh, well, you know, cops are just gunning down black people at random, no. Black community has a much higher crime rate, and they have a lot more interactions with cops, and they also have a much higher incidence of illegal possession of firearms, okay? So you're going to have a number of them get shot, but a lot more white people still get killed every year by policemen. Now, on to this, the wonderful story of Maria Butina. This is the NRA Russian spy. First, I want to say, if she's a spy, she's the worst Russian spy who's ever lived, because everywhere she goes, when she was introduced to people working with the NRA, she introduced herself as a Russian who's trying to start her own version of the NRA in Russia, which actually does exist, okay? The Russians are very big, they're very pro-gun, they like to own guns. And she was apparently started out around 2012 networking with the NRA, building up relations with politicians and so forth. And no surprise that she wanted to build relationships with pro-gun politicians in America, and she went to the Republican Party. Hardly a shock, okay? And anyway, I don't know where this story is going, but it's pretty amusing. Vox has sort of an interesting article about it, talks about what she's doing. But this Russian spy business has gotten silly. If this girl is a Russian spy, the standards of Russian spycraft has really gone down in the last 20 years. There she is with Scott Walker, and the fellow on the left is Alexander Torshin. He's a well-known Russian oligarch. He's got a lot of money. He's involved with Russian banks. Everybody knows who he is. These people were not going under the radar. They were very open about their activities involving the NRA, and let's see how that turns out, okay? Keep that space open in your head, okay? And now on to this. This is one of my favorites. This is Dianne Feinstein and her Chinese spy. Here's this. Dianne Feinstein was the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Big deal in Washington. She's from California, San Francisco. She's been in Washington for years. She's a big anti-gun advocate. And she apparently had a Chinese spy in her employ for over 20 years. She didn't know about it. She was told about it a few years ago, and she made the guy take an early retirement. And when this broke in the news the other day, she tried to cover her ass by saying he was just a driver and sort of an office gopher, and he did odds and ends for us, but he wasn't really involved in much. They would really try to underplay who this guy is. And it went on. And of course, the mainstream media gobbled that up and said, oh, well, that's fine. If you're just nobody. He took an early retirement. No harm, no foul. The guy got recruited by the Chinese when he went home on vacation at one point, it turns out. All right. But lo and behold, some people did some looking at a thing called the Sunlight Foundation, who digs into the backgrounds, the paperwork filed by government offices. What they found out was the Chinese spy, Mr. Russell Lowe, not only was not just a chauffeur or driver, which he may have driven around once in a while, I'm sure. He was her office director. He was in charge of her San Francisco office, which is her main office. And he also represented the Chinese community. He went to the consulate functions on behalf of the senator, and he was very involved and had access to probably to all kinds of things that went through her office at any given time. All right, so much for just a driver. He wasn't. All right, and now on to this. This is a story that popped up on Democracy Now! In case you missed it. If you don't read the site, it's a crazy site. It's hilarious. But they said, like a kidnapping, Minnesota man snatched by ICE agents at courthouse. And I saw this headline. I said, gee, that's kind of rough. What do you mean they grabbed a guy, pulled him out of the courthouse? What did he do? You know, this kind of thing. And I went over here and read the story. The Twin Cities Pioneer Press had this story. They covered it nationally. They included a lot more information. Like I said, Democracy Now! Sort of just said, yeah, he was snatched. And, you know, on that sound alone, it sounds like bad. You know, they went and just took this guy. Well, they had a reason to take this guy. He was a pretty bad guy. All right. Carlos Urrutia was shortly after his judge sentenced him on July 26 to 5 years of supervised probation, on one count of criminal vehicular operation while under the influence of alcohol. Well, it sounds like he just got pulled over for drunk driving. All right. If you go down and read a little bit more, he originally was from Mexico. He is not an American citizen. He's been here illegally for 2.5 decades. Had already spent 168 days in jail following his arrest in the spring of 2017. See, now we're going back a year. All right. And he was supposed to be deported on Tuesday, but he was granted a little bit of a delay at the very end by the judge, apparently. Then the ICE officers came in afterwards, and they identified themselves. They put him under arrest and took him out as soon as he was convicted of a felony for injuring a pedestrian with his vehicle while under the influence of alcohol. See, he wasn't just drunk driving. He ran somebody over, okay? And he also had 3 prior criminal convictions, including 2 for intoxicated driving, drunk driving. I think the other one was for fraud or check fraud or credit card fraud or something. He's a real peach. What happened, though, in this case was that he struck a pedestrian, a 20-year-old girl who was crossing the street, and she was taken to the hospital in an ambulance, where she underwent emergency brain surgery due to injuries sustained in the crash. Well, it wasn't a crash. She was hit, okay? They make it sound like she was driving a car. She was subsequently diagnosed with significant traumatic brain injury that necessitated extensive rehabilitation. Okay, he was loaded at the time the cops could smell his breath, and that's why when this was over, ICE swooped in and grabbed him. Okay, he was not a good guy, and he needed to be gotten rid of. Get him the hell out of here. Okay, hardly a good guy. All right, and now on to this. Mother of 11 children found at filthy New Mexico New Mexico compound, okay? And you've all seen this story. And at a first glance, when it first came out the way the media presented it, it looked like maybe it's one of these, nutty white wing groups or survivalist groups or something crazy going on, out there in the desert. And I thought, gee, it sounds a little strange. So I went and read the article. And one of the people arrested was Siraj Ibn Wahhaj, okay? And I heard that name, and I said, boy, I know that name. How do I know that name, okay? And it turns out this isn't this fellow is not the reason I know his name. It was because of his father. His father is a notorious guy. All right, but at any rate, they had these 11 kids out there. This guy's wanted for kidnapping. They found them all 11 children living in squalid conditions with basically no food other than rotting potatoes, and they had buckets of dirty water to drink out of. And one of the kids very bravely got a note out to enforcement saying, "Rescue us, we are literally starving to death." All right, but what was interesting was that during this whole thing, when this guy had disappeared and kidnapped these kids going back a while, his dad had made a post. They're Muslims, and he made a post on Facebook begging for the safe returns. Dear brothers and sisters, please make du'as for the safe return of our children and grandchildren. And then he names them all in here, okay? He wrote that on January 5th. And it sounds sad, the poor grandpa's missing his kids. Well, it must be just awful for him. And he's an imam, and this is how I knew who he was. He's the imam involved with the original bombing of the World Trade Center. He testified in favor on behalf of the blind sheikh who orchestrated the whole thing. And he was also, this is the dad right here, he was also listed as one of the possible co-conspirators in the bombing of the World Trade Center. He advocates, and it's on his page, it's published, this isn't some conspiracy thing, he's talked about it. He has said these things to, the governor, to the mayor of New York, that he would like to see democracy gotten rid of in America and to bring in Sharia law, okay? And he has said so. He's quoted as saying so many times. He supports Islamic laws over laws of democracy. He supports capital punishment. He supports cutting off of hands for thieves, whippings. He believes in stoning women to death for infidelity, and all kinds of other crazy stuff. The guy is a lunatic. All right, and oh surprise, his son is also a lunatic. All right, so the story in the desert of New Mexico with this guy who ran off with the kids runs back now to dad in New York City, who's a radical jihadist, basically. All right, and I know people think that's inflammatory, but it's really not. That's what he is, and he's self-admitted. Okay, so that's the news for the week. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. And we'll do another one at some point in the pretty near future. Okay, give us a subscription, a thumbs up, sign up for us. And when we do something, you'll get notified. All right, click the bell. All right, bye-bye.